Let's start today's session. Today, I will focus on mediation analysis and actually we will discuss how we can hypothesize mediation hypothesis and then how we can assess mediation hypothesis. So because these two parts are very important and there are many sometimes misunderstanding about hypothesizing mediation construct and also assessment of mediation construct. And sometimes there are some mess between these two for hypothesizing and assessment. We need to differentiate between these two parts, and we need to understand the way that we can hypothesize mediation or mediator construct, and then how we can assess. Okay. Mediator hypothesis, actually, in many of the studies, we, based on the objective of the study, we have to assess some variable, that these variable called mediator or mediation. Actually, mediator variable is a variable that the role of mediator is transmit the effect of independent variable to dependent variable. So when we have mediator variable, the role of this mediator is to explain the effect of IV on DV and actually show us the mechanism of this effect. So when one variable intervenes between two other variables, between one IV and D. In many studies, actually the mediator, we use mediator and we need to assess mediator. For example, if we look at this statistic from Hayes and Schwartz paper, this paper is very important paper. Later we will go back to this paper and see how actually we can assess mediator and what's the differences between different approaches and methods for assessment of mediator. So this paper is one of the most important paper for assessment of mediator. In this paper, Hayes and Schwartz actually review 454 papers that published in 2011 and 2012 in the Journal of, I'm not mistaken, Journal of Psychological Science. And they identified that 71 papers out of these 454 papers included at least one mediator. So among these 450 plus papers, more than 50% of these papers included mediator. So they actually concluded that assessment of mediator, because of vast application of mediator in different studies, are very important, and actually we should be careful, and we need to understand how we can assess mediator, and also how can we hypothesize mediator. Also in other disciplines, if you go to management, marketing, business, tourism, information system, many in different disciplines, you can see many papers apply, many studies apply Mediator, and actually included Mediator in their study, right? So it's very important to understand the concept of Mediator and assessment of Mediator. Here is a very simple example to understand the meaning of Mediator. Later, I will, based on this simple, I will go through hypothesizing Mediator. For example, if in one study, we want to see the effect of the seawater temperature. And based on previous studies, we know seawater temperature, increasing seawater temperature will increase the number of incidents, right? And we hypothesize this relationship. Seawater temperature increase the number of incidents, right? So in first place, when we look at this hypothesis, it's not very clear for us that how and why seawater temperature should have the positive effect on number of incidents, right? But when we look at the literature indeed, we understand that, okay, there is another variable that this variable can come between these two variables, between this IV and EV. This variable is number of swimmers. So when we say a seawater temperature increase, increasing seawater temperature can increase the number of swimmers. The warmer the water, the more swimmers. So increasing the number of swimmers will increase the number of incidents. So the more swimmers, the more incidents. So now by including this variable, number of swimmers, between seawater temperature and number of incidents, we can understand the mechanism of effect of seawater temperature on number of incidents. So mediator variable and mediation is actually we apply mediator to understand mechanism of effect of IV on V, right? So this is the main role of mediator. Okay, we published this paper in 2020, this year, in Journal of Travel Research. And so it's still is hot from oven. In this paper, we assess the mediation role of resident perception between some antecedents and support for tourism development. So here, resident perception mediates the relationship between these variables and support. But what does it mean? It means we actually investigate the effect of community attachment, environmental attitude, cultural attitude, economic gain, and involvement, these antecedents. The effect of these antecedents on support for tourism development is whether it's a direct effect or this effect is transferred through resident perception. Again, what does it mean? It means this variable, increasing, for example, community attachment. We want to understand this concept. Increasing community attachment directly will increase support for tourism development, or increasing community attachment will increase, in first place, will increase perception of people, perception of residents. And then by increasing perception of residents, their support for tourism development will increase. So which one? What is the mechanism of effect of community attachment to support? It is a direct effect. The mechanism is a direct effect, or there are some variables that these variables transfer this effect. So this is the meaning of mediator. No, so now I want to go to hypothesizing mediator. So if we understand this concept, that the mediator is something, some variable, some concept that explain the mechanism of effect of IV on DV. So this understanding help us to see how can we hypothesize this mechanism, hypothesize this effect. Actually, this paper is very good paper to understand. Our actual intention to publish this paper was to explain these two parts for mediator assessment. One, how can we hypothesize, and how can we assess? So it's good to go through this paper and read this paper. So this may help you to understand better the concept of mediator. Okay, so how can we hypothesize? If we know mediator is something that explains the mechanism, so that mediation hypothesis should be community attachment has indirect effect on support for tourism development through resident perception. Right? So, okay, or resident perception mediate relationship between community attachment and support for tourism development. This is the hypothesis, type of hypothesis, and the ways that we can write hypothesis for mediator. But how can we support this hypothesis by theory and literature? This is challenging part for hypothesis development for mediator. Some researchers think when we want to hypothesize mediator, we need to find in the literature, we need to find exactly some previous study that assess this mediator and hypothesize this mediator. But it's not possible, always is not possible. Because sometimes mediator is a contribution that we want to actually make this contribution by introducing a mediator. So there is not previous studies that hypothesize this variable as a mediator. So in this case, how can we hypothesize? Again, look at the definition and concept. Resident perception transfer the effect of community attachment on support. So community attachment affect influence on support through resident perception. Based on this hypothesis, what we need to have from theory and previous study? What we need to have from theory and previous study? In first place, we need to support relationship and effect of community attachment on support, right? When we say resident perception mediates relationship between community attachment and support, or we say community attachment has indirect effect on support for tourism development. through resident perception. It means the belief community attachment has effect on support. I'm not talking about statistical assessment now. I'm only talking about theoretical support and hypothesizing mediator. There is a misunderstanding between these two parts. We have a method called Baron and Kenny method. Baron and Kenny method is a causal steps for assessment of mediator, for statistical assessment of mediator. Still, I'm not talking about assessment of mediator. So don't get this wrong, right? Now I'm only talking about hypothesis development. Okay, so for hypothesis development, we need theory and previous studies to support effect of IV on DV, right? Because actually we want to hypothesize effect of community attachment on support for tourism development. Community attachment on support for tourism development through resident perception. We want to assess indirect effect. So to hypothesize, we need to support this relationship, this effect. So we need theoretical support for this relationship. Another thing, when we want to hypothesize mediation role of resident perception between the community attachment and support, we need to have support from literature for the effect of community attachment on resident perception, right? Because when we say community attachment transmit the effect of IV on DV, it means community attachment, it means IV should affect on mediator or resident perception, and also resident perception on support. So we need support from the literature and theory for the effect of mediator on DV. Again, I'm not talking about Baron and Kenny approach. Baron and Kenny's statistical part, right? I'm talking about hypothesis development. So if we want to hypothesize a mediator between IV and DV, we need support from theory and from previous study, empirical previous study and literature for the effect of IV on DV, IV on mediator, and mediator on DV. So no need to have mediation hypothesis in previous studies to support your mediator hypothesis. But you need support from theory and previous studies for these relationships to be able to hypothesize mediation role, hypothesize mediation effect, right? So this is very, very important and first step for hypothesis development. So later we will see Baron and Kenny's statistical approach for assessment of mediator. And actually Baron and Kenny include these 3 steps. And we will see Baron and Kenny is a dead approach, very low power approach for assessment of mediator. So for assessment of mediator, we don't use Baron and Kenny. But for hypothesizing mediator, still we can use these steps only for hypothesizing mediator. So we need support from theory and previous studies to support for relationship or effect of IV on DV, IV on mediator, and mediator on DV. So if we have support from theory for these relationships, we can hypothesize mediator, and no need to have exactly mediation hypothesis before in previous study. If you look at this paper, actually in this paper, we apply two theories, social exchange theory and Weber theory of rationality. So based on these two theories, we hypothesize mediation and also hypothesize direct effect. So we apply this theory. For example, we apply social exchange theory for the effect of antecedent on support and for the effect of resident perception on support. But for the effect of antecedent on resident perception, we apply Weber's theory of rationality. Because social exchange theory criticized many recent studies for effect of antecedent on resident perception. So we didn't use social exchange theory for this relationship. We apply Weber theory for this relationship, antecedent on resident perception, antecedent on mediator. But for the effect of antecedent on support and mediator on support, we use social exchange theory. So we combine these two theories to hypothesize mediator. So this is a very, very critical and important part for mediation hypothesis. Somebody raise their hand and have a question, but I prefer you keep your question and later we can go back to this part and answer your question. Okay, so first part, like other type of method that we use or other types of studies, always the first and one of the most important part is hypothesizing, quantitative research, hypothesizing our relationship and effect for developing our hypothesis. And for developing our hypothesis, all type of hypothesis, including direct effect or mediation or moderator, we need the support from two parts. We need support from theory and we need support from previous empirical study. So we have to develop our theoretical framework, means the theory that we apply to support our hypothesis. And also we need to support our hypothesis based on previous study, empirical study. And the mediator is exactly the same. But what we need to have for mediator, it's not necessary to have mediation hypothesis in previous study. Or it's very difficult to find the theory to support mediator, right? But it's possible to actually apply theory and support our relationship, effect of IV on DV, effect of IV on mediator, and mediator on DV from previous study. So based on these three steps, we can hypothesize mediator. Correct. If you are familiar with Boron and Kenny approach, we'd say, okay, these three steps are three steps of Boron and Kenny approach. Yeah, I agree. But again, I'm not talking about assessment of mediator. I'm talking about hypothesis development. So I believe still these three steps of Boron and Kenny are valid for hypothesis development, right? Not for hypothesis testing, for hypothesis development. Okay. Okay. Let's go. Let's move on. This is actually mathematical or a statistical presentation of mediator. When we have the effect of X on Y, so this C can be called the total effect. And when we put a mediator here, so this C is divided to two parts. Part of effect is transferred through M. So this effect is AB effect. And part of effect is supreme. And these two effects together are total effect. So here you can see C equals this supreme plus AB. And this AB is indirect. We call this term indirect. Okay, here. And this is direct effect after inclusion of mediator. And this C is total effect. Right? So this is a mathematical representation for mediation when we include mediator in our framework. This one is simple mediator that we have only one mediator. But when we have more than one mediator, you can see this mathematical formula. So the total effect will include the supreme direct effect, A1, B1, and A2, B2. So we have two indirect effects. And these mediators are called serial mediators. So we have here, we have multiple mediation. Or this is more complex. We have two parallel mediator between X and Y. So we have different terms to explain indirect effect. Here we have three indirect effects. Effect of X on W, so A1, 3, 1. Effect of M on Y, so it's A3, B2. Effect of A1, A3, B2. So we have two mediator between X and Y. For the effect of X on Y, also we have only if we connect M to Y, we have A1, B1, and also A2, B2. So here we have a very complex mediator and different parallel mediator. Okay. Okay. Now I'm going to review different tests for mediator. So far, I discussed only hypothesis development for mediator. For testing mediator, we McKinnon 2002 reviewed actually 14 tests for assessment of the mediator. And they actually categorize these 14 tests in 3 groups. The first group is causal steps. So in first group, like Baron and Kenny approach, the most popular approach belonging to first category is Baron and Kenny approach. So in Baron and Kenny approach, we pass some causal steps to assess mediator. In Baron and Kenny, we assess direct effect before including mediator and see is it significant or not. So if it's significant, and then we include mediator, an effect of IV on DV, IV on mediator should be significant, So now I'm talking about statistical testing, right? So the effect of IV on DV, IV on M, mediator should be significant. Effect of M on DV should be significant. So based on this, we can conclude M is mediator between IB and DB. This is causal steps for assessment of mediator. First category of assessment of mediator. So in first category, that Baron and Kinney is most popular method, we actually assess based on these steps. And if we pass these steps, we can conclude M is mediator between X and Y. Second group, assess the difference between direct effects. The difference between direct effects before and after including mediator. So we assess C minus C prime. So this is second group of methods for assessment of mediator, right? Among these 14 tests. But these 14 tests are not all. We have more tests for assessment of mediator. That these more tests belong to one of these three groups. And the third group focus on product of coefficient of indirect effect. So the third group focus on this term, AB term. AB term. And this AB term called indirect effect. So third group assess significance of this term. Significance of this term. So in first group, we assess some steps. So we have causal steps like Baron and Kinney. Second group, we assess C minus C prime. And the third group, we assess significance of AB. We assess significance of indirect. Right? And under each group, we have several methods. This is a Baron and Kinney approach. Baron and Kinney approach, now based on recent literature, is a dead approach for assessment of, is outdated approach for assessment of mediator. So if you apply Baron and Kinney for assessment of mediator, your paper will be rejected, definitely. Because no more acceptable, this method is no more acceptable for assessment of statistical assessment of mediator, right? But this method includes these three steps. This paper Hayes and Schwarzkopf did simulation study and compare some methods belong to these three groups, including mediator, including Baron and Kinney, and including some methods belong to third group. There's another misunderstanding. For third group, we have delta methods, we have percentile and bias corrected bootstrapping method confidence interval. So we calculate confidence interval based on bias corrected bootstrapping or percentile bootstrapping. So based on this confidence interval, we assess significance of indirect effect or product of coefficient. In the first method, we assess significance of product of coefficient or indirect effect based on Sobel test. And we have also some other tests. So under third group, also we have many different tests. One of the famous tests is Sobel test, right? But Sobel test is not only test. Under delta methods, we have Arion test, we have Goodman test, and the formula to calculate significance of product of coefficient AB is different, right? So still using Sobel test, Arion test, Goodman test, we calculate significance of AB, product of coefficient. But the work of Hayes and Schwartz, 2013, and based on the simulation that they have done, they recommend to avoid Sobel test. And also, they concluded Bourne and Kenny is one of the least powerful approach for assessment of mediator. It's a very low power approach for assessment of mediator. So, Bourne and Kenny, and also these category of tests like Sobel test, Orient test, and Goodman test were rejected in work of Hayes and Schwartz. Even Sobel test belong to third group, but still is not a trustworthy test. I saw some study that combine, for example, Bourne and Kenny and Sobel test to increase the robustness of result. So we use two rejected method, two unacceptable method, and we think by using two methods, we can increase robustness of our analysis. But it's not correct. Sobel test, both Sobel test and Bourne and Kenny for assessment of mediator based on recent studies are not valid, are not acceptable, right? So what's the best method? The best method for assessment of mediator is still belong to third category, but using bias corrected bootstrapping or percentile bootstrapping confidence interval. Actually, AB is a non-parametric term. So for this non-parametric term, we have to apply non-parametric method. And these two methods are the best for assessment of significance of this term, AB, or indirect effect. So for assessment of mediator, the best approach is assessment of indirect effect using bootstrapping, bias corrected, either bias corrected or percentile bootstrapping, confidence interval, right? So for assessment of mediator, is not compulsory to check direct effect. Is not compulsory to check A to X to M or M to Y. Only we need to check, we need to assess AB term, product of coefficients term, indirect effect term, based on bootstrapping, confidence interval, right? So now we are in other ground. So we have two different grounds. First, how we can hypothesize. Second, how we can assess. For hypothesizing mediator, still we can apply some causal steps for hypothesizing. But for assessment of mediator, causal steps, no more valid method. And we have to use product of coefficient using bootstrapping confidence interval, right? This diagram is from Zhao, and this is very good diagram to understand and to interpret, especially interpret the meaning of mediator. In this diagram, you can see A, B term, so indirect effect term. So if AB term is not significant, means you don't have mediator. So in first step, we need to assess significance of indirect effect. If it's not significant, so we don't have mediator. If it's significant, right? If it's significant, so we have some steps to check. If it's significant and supreme direct effect after including mediator is not significant. It means all effect of X and Y transfer from mediator. I'm not talking about full or partial mediation. Full or partial mediation is some concept that belong to Baron and Kenny approach. So when we left Baron and Kenny approach, we don't use Baron and Kenny approach. So we don't use these terms, partial and full mediation. But if we have supreme, because in some study, when we apply a product of coefficient, we don't have direct effect, and it's not compulsory to have direct effect. Depends on our objective. If we have, and is not significant after including mediator, so we can conclude and we can discuss all effects of X to Y transfer from mediator, not directly. But if supreme is significant, still is significant, and now we look at the sign of direct effect and sign of indirect effect. If both signs are same, are identical, so both are positive or both are negative, so our mediator is complementary mediator. But if the sign of mediator and direct effect are different, are opposite, so the mediator is competitive. So it means mediator and direct effect compete for transferring the effect of X to Y. Here is very good to discuss our result. For example, I don't use the term of full and partial mediation, but I like the discussion and comparison between indirect effect and direct effect. If we hypothesize also direct effect in our paper. For example, in this paper, we hypothesize both direct effect and indirect effect. And based on the result, we can actually discuss that the effect of community attachment to support for tourism. This effect will transfer through resident perception or directly to support. It means when we compare these two, indirect and direct effect, we can see which one is most important for transferring effect of community attachment to support. It means most of this effect first will increase the perception of resident, and then by increasing the perception of resident, increasing of perception will push them to support for tourism, or community attachment directly affect on support. So which one is important? Based on this result here, and see this is complementary or competitive, and if it's complementary, what's the weight of each one? Which one is more important? So you can do a very good discussion for assessment of mediator, right? So this paper is very good paper for understanding this process and assessment. Also, this paper is very good paper by Nitzel and his colleague, and very clear paper to for assessment of mediator and the process for assessment of mediator, especially when we apply PLS. As I mentioned before, this is our paper that we published recently, and this paper is if you go through, you can see these two parts, how you can hypothesize mediator and also how you can assess. Okay, let me go to software. And see how we can. Okay. Now you can see SmartPLS, right? You can see, right? Okay. In SmartPLS software, I use the framework that we created before for higher order construct. Remember, perceived impact is a higher order construct, and we created this second order, right? But now we want to use this model for assessment of mediator. We want to see perceived impact is a significant mediator for relationship between this antecedent and the support or not, right? Okay, here I don't have direct relationship. It depends on your objective. If in your study you want to hypothesize also direct relationship, okay, you can create direct relationship also between antecedent and your DD. But for assessment of mediator is not compulsory to have these direct effects, right? Only we need to assess indirect effects. So in this step, I don't connect independent variable to DD. And I want to assess mediation role of perceived impact between these four antecedents and support for tourism, right? Okay. So for assessment of mediator, when we create our framework, we need to run PLS algorithm in SPSS. Okay. And when you run PLS algorithm, you can see the result of indirect effects here. One of the results that you can get is indirect. If you click on indirect effect, here you can see the effect of community attachment to support, but indirect effect of community attachment to support. Because actually here we don't have any direct relationship between these four: community attachment, economic gain, environmental attitude, and cultural attitude on support. Only you have indirect effect. So here, what you have is indirect effect, A-B term, product of coefficient term. So here you can see the effect of community attachment. So the first one is community attachment, perceived impact on support. So the first one is this indirect effect. And this indirect effect is 0, 1, 3, 3. Second one is cultural attitude, perceived impact, support. So it's minus 0.003. Third one is economic gain on perceived impact and support. And the fourth one, environmental attitude, perceived impact on support. So we have three indirect effects here. And we can see this indirect effect here, right? But still, we don't know these indirect effects are significant or not. So we have to apply product of coefficient or significant assessment of significance of indirect effect using bootstrapping confidence interval. So to get the result of bootstrapping confidence interval, we have to run bootstrapping. We have to run bootstrapping, and only I put 500, but for actual study you can put 5,000. And here I need here you can get percentile bootstrap, but here I want to get bias corrected confidence interval. So click on this option, and you can also choose one tail or two tail based on your hypothesis. If for example, you know, in this indirect effect is positive or negative, so it's one tail. So you hypothesize in one tail way, so you can change to one tail. But if it's two tail, you can keep this two tail. So I change to one tail and start calculation. Okay. Here you can see p-value, t-value for okay. You need to click on indirect effect. Here is for pad coefficient. You need to click on indirect effect. But in SmartPLS, we have two options: total indirect effect and specific indirect effect. It is for some situation that between IV and DV, we have more than one variable. We have more than one mediator. If we have more than one mediator, we need to click on specific indirect. But if we have only one mediator between IV and DV, the result in total indirect effect and specific indirect effect will be same, right? So if we click on specific indirect effect, okay, here you can see community attachment, perceived impact, support, cultural attitude, perceived impact, support, and these four indirect effects. And this part you can get t-value and p-value, but we are interested for this part, confidence interval bias corrected, right? So here you have these four indirect effect, and this is indirect effect. We got this indirect effect in first part in PLS algorithm analysis. So these are exactly same as these four indirect effects. Here we have lower level and upper level of confidence interval bias corrected. These two values for this effect to be significant, these two values should not include 0. So if 0 doesn't fall within lower and upper level of confidence interval, it means our indirect effect and our mediator is significant. It means M mediate relationship between X and Y. What about these four? We have four indirect effects here. First one, lower level is 0.085 and upper level of the confidence interval is 0.196. So 0 is not between these two values. So it means the first hypothesis, the first indirect effect is significant. Second one, the lower level is minus 0.052 and higher level is 0.045. So 0 is between these two values. 0 falls between these two, right? So the second hypothesis and the second indirect effect is not significant. So perceived impact cannot mediate relationship between cultural attitude and support, but mediates relationship between community attachment and support. What about third one? Third one, the lower level is 0.125. The upper level is 0.201. So 0 doesn't fall between these two values. So it means the third indirect effect also is significant, and we can support this hypothesis. Perceived impact mediates relationship between economic gain and support. And the last one also is significant because 0 is not between 0.139 and 0.248. So based on this, we can actually report indirect effect and assess mediation hypothesis. Let me show this one in our paper. For example, okay, this is our paper. Before show you. Okay, here you can see indirect effect. So we have 4 indirect effects. We have 4 indirect effect here and 4 mediation hypotheses. Sorry, 5. And here you can see confidence interval bias corrected for each one. And you can see the result. For example, the first one, the value is 0.0 because we had 2 different case studies, 2 different study areas. So for first one is 0.074, and for second one is 0.076 indirect effect. And the confidence interval for first one is lower level is 0.042 and upper level is 0.122. So it's significant. And also for another case, 0.044 and 0.119. So you can see for first indirect effect, for both case study, we can support mediation role of perception between community attachment and support for tourism. So this is the way that we can write the result in hypothesis testing table. This table is hypothesis testing. So we have all hypotheses, including direct and indirect hypotheses. So this is the way that we can report hypothesis. Okay, so you can see the result here. This is for actually simple mediator. Also, we can assess multiple mediator if we have some serial mediator or parallel mediator. Okay, let me show you only one serial mediator. Okay, let's delete this one. Okay, it's better to duplicate. So before I showed you that if we want to use a framework for another study in the SmartPLS, we can right click on path model and duplicate path model. So when duplicate path model, for example, here, you can see a SmartPLS interface, right? Mediator. Okay. So I created another path model, and in this path model, let me delete this one. And now I want to create 3 mediator, and these 3 mediator are economic impact, social impact. So I separate these three and put as a separate mediator. So now, okay. Okay, and connect. So simplify model, I hide all indicators. So now we have three different mediator between our antecedent and the PD, right? So we have three mediators. So these three mediators are serial mediator, right? Serial mediator. So the process is exactly the same. Close this one and the PLS algorithm. So here you can see indirect effect, right? Okay, change the name. Economy. Impact. And this one. Okay, so you can see here indirect effect.
Sorry, Prof, to interrupt. Can I ask a question?
Wait, please wait. Now I finish and you can ask me. Okay, so here we have only 4 values, right? Here we have only 4 values. For the effect of community attachment to support, right? But actually between community attachment and support, we have 3 different mediators. So this effect is total indirect effect. But when we run bootstrapping, because for each indirect effect, we need to see significance of indirect effect, right? So when we run bootstrapping,
Anji?
so here you have specific indirect. Could please unmute? So here you have the specific indirect effect. So now you can see community attachment on environmental, community attachment on economic perceived impact to support, and community attachment on social perceived impact and on support. So you can see these 3 different indirect effects. And now you have 12 indirect effects. And you can see this specific indirect effect. If you click on confidence interval, you can see these effects on this part, and you can actually report based on the result of a lower level and upper level of confidence interval, and of course interpret in your work. Okay, so now if you have any question, go ahead.
Yes, Prof. Can I ask? I've got two
Yes, yes,
questions.
please.
Uh, First question, when you explain one tail and two, can you explain one tail, two tail? First question, and second question is, uh, uh, do we call multiple mediation as parallel mediation are same? Second question. And the third is, I'm facing problem while doing a serial mediation. Can you run just a model here for this and interpret them, because I'm confused how to interpret the results for serial mediations. I
Okay.
hope this will help others also. I've questions, a lot questions. Thank you. Thank
Okay.
you.
For first one tail and two tail depends on your hypothesis. For example, if we say, if we hypothesize community attachment has indirect effect on support for tourism development through economic perceived impact. So you can you mention positive indirect effect. So you know this effect is positive from the literature and from theory. So you hypothesize one tail and you have to choose one tail. But if you don't know this indirect effect is positive or negative, right? So this will be two tail. So this is first question. Second question for what was second question for serial mediator?
Second was,
Multiple multiple mediator include both several or parallel or combination of serial or parallel.
yes, right, right. Okay.
So when we have a combination, more than one mediator, and the mediator is not only a simple mediator, this is called multiple. So there can be serial, can be parallel, or can be combination. That's the second question. And third question for serial mediator. Okay, let me just change this model, and this is not in real world, but just to show you how we can create and how we can interpret. I change this a parallel mediator to serial mediator, delete environmental attitude, environmental perceived impact, and also delete connection between antecedent and social perceived impact. Okay, and put social perceived impact between economic perceived impact and support. So we have effect of economic perceived impact on support, right? And let's, for example, connect community attachment to support, and economic gain also to support. Okay. So here we have a bit more complicated framework. So we have two mediators between community attachment and economic gain, environmental attitude, and cultural attitude and support. When we have two mediators, it means in first place, we need the support for hypothesizing this mediator. It means these two variables together, if you look at the effect of community attachment and support, it means these two variables together mediate relationship between community attachment and support. It means the effect of community attachment first increase level of for positive effect, increase level of first mediator, then increasing level of first mediator will increase level of second mediator, and increase the level of second mediator will increase the level of DB. So these two mediators together actually transfer the effect of community attachment on support. So this is the way that we hypothesize. And we need support from the literature for this direct for this effect, not direct, for this effect, community attachment to support, for effect of community attachment on first mediator to second mediator, and second mediator to DV. But the way that we actually run the analysis is exactly the same. Go to PLS algorithm, run, and then go to bootstrapping, and run bootstrapping. Okay. So for this serial mediator, you want to see effect of, you want to see this indirect effect. Okay, you want to see, for example, this is A1, this is B1, and this is C1. So you want A1 multiply B1 multiply C1, right? So you want this indirect effect to actually confirm M1, EPI, and SPI mediates the relationship between community attachment and support, right? So you need to assess this significance of this term. Okay, if you go to result of bootstrapping, and again go to a specific indirect effect, okay, here you can see this indirect effect with 3 paths, not 2 paths like before. Here we have 2 paths, but here we have 3 paths. Community attachment to first mediator, EPI, and EPI to SPI, and SPI to support. So here you can see this is p-value, and if you go to confidence interval, also in confidence interval, in this part, you can see lower level and upper level for this indirect effect. And this indirect effect include 2 serial mediators. So for this indirect effect, lower level is 0.01, upper level is 0.048. So 0 is not included in this range. It's not between these 2 values. So based on bias corrected confidence interval, we can support this indirect effect. We can support this serial mediator, right? Is it clear?
Yes, Prof. But what about the other relationships? Like now we can say that serial mediation exists depending on the bootstrapping. And what about the other? This is a combined effect. What about, like, if we are we going to report the significance of EPI to SPI and
Depend
SPI
on
to?
your hypothesis. Depend on
Okay.
your hypothesis. Yeah. Please be careful. In this part, you assess your hypothesis, right?
Right. Right.
In first place, you need to understand and you need to actually be confident about hypothesis development. Based on your objective, what hypothesis you need to develop and you need to test. Any hypothesis you develop in first part, you can assess in last part, in analysis part, right? So reporting and interpretation is based on your hypothesis. If you hypothesize this relationship, for example, this direct effect of community attachment on support, or if you hypothesize, for example, indirect effect of community attachment or SPI, this is meaningful, for example, in your research, based on your objective. So you need to report this indirect effect. But if only you hypothesize this relationship through these 2 variables, And only this is meaningful in your research based on your objective and based on your theoretical framework. So you only report this indirect effect. So it depends on your objective, right?
Right. Thank you very much, Professor. I've clearly understood, and hopefully it will help others also. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Any other question?
Okay. Hello, Prof.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to ask a question related to serial mediation. Actually, Prof, it is very easy to justify the serial mediation in terms of mathematics. But do you have any particular logic with the theoretical foundation of the serial mediation? And any good journal, we have an article in any good journal or thesis that how we can justify the serial mediation?
As I explained before, justification for serial mediator, for parallel mediator, for simple mediator, for direct effect should be, in first place, should be based on theoretical framework and based on literature. So before you decide to assess any type of hypothesis, you have to actually hypothesize. You have to support your hypothesis based on theory and literature. So this is the first place. So when you have serial mediator, in first place, you need to support based on theory. Mathematical formula, mathematical presentation, and assessment is in second place in analysis part. So if you have serial mediator, how you can support by theory, as I explained before, you need to pass some steps. When we say these two variables, these two mediator, EPI and SPI, for example, together mediate relationship between community attachment and support, or you say community attachment as indirect effect on support through EPI and SPI, it means you have some logic behind that. What's your logic? First, you say community attachment based on literature and based on theory has effect on support, directly or indirectly. But you have theory to support this relationship because your hypothesis refer to relationship or effect of community attachment on support, directly or through some variable. So you need support from theory for this effect. Second one, you want to actually justify serial mediator. So you need to support effect of community attachment on first mediator based on theory and literature. Mediator 1 to mediator 2 based on theory and literature. And mediator 2 and DV based on theory and literature. Right? We need to we need to understand the meaning of theory. What's the theory? Theory is something that we apply to explain and to justify social phenomena, right?
Okay.
So because of that,
but Prof, there is another problem. So what is the difference between network mediation and serial? Because I think it's more towards network mediation, network modeling. Actually, I want to say.
okay. What's the meaning of network modeling?
Because it is connected with two phenomena, and then we are going for the DV. So,
but depends on these two phenomena how interconnected, right? For example, if I have another connection here,
yeah,
right? So this will be another story, right? This will be another story. Now I'm not talking about the form of your relationship. I said if you have hypotheses, mediation hypotheses, you have to support different paths, different actually the part of your mediation hypothesis based on theory. For example, for this one, okay, if you want to hypothesize this mediator, here you have more complex, more complicated, right? Compared to before. Here you say, okay, EPI independently mediate relationship between community attachment and support. Also, EPI and SPI together mediate relationship between community attachment and support. If you want to hypothesize these two mediators, right, you need to support from literature and theory for each one, for different paths that you have. For this one, okay, you need three different logics. You say community attachment has effect on support, but through EPI, don't consider all other relationship. Through the EPI, this is your hypothesis. Community attachment has indirect effect on support through EPI, means this relationship, this indirect relationship. So EPI is now mediator between these two. How we need to hypothesize and support by theory? Okay, you say community attachment to support, so you need to support theory for this relationship, not this direct, not this direct. Overall, effect of community attachment and support. For this indirect effect, you need to support effect of community attachment to EPI and EPI to support, to be able to justify this hypothesis. When you add another variable here, you have two variables. So you have serial variable for this relationship, for this indirect effect. For this indirect effect, you say community attachment has indirect effect on support through EPI and SPI. Now, you don't talk about this relationship. You don't talk about this relationship. You say this effect, part of this effect, transfer to support through these two together. So when we say serial here, it means, okay, based on literature, you need to support community attachment and support for tourism. For this serial mediator, you need to understand and you need to approve, justify effect of community attachment on EPI, EPI on SPI, and SPI on support, right?
Okay.
So you have different paths, and these paths should be supported by theory.
Okay. Actually, Prof, can I take a liberty of one more thing?
Yes.
Actually, sometimes it happens that, for example, this community attachment in EPI, this is supported by one theory, and the second mediator and the dependent variable is supported by another theory.
Yes,
And
exactly.
so how we will explain this is a serial mediation and how it is different from the network model.
If you don't have the support for effect of EPI on SPI,
yeah,
I understand you. You say, okay, EPI is supported by one theory.
Yeah.
SPI is supported by another theory.
Yes.
You don't have any support for the relationship between EPI and SPI.
Yes.
You cannot hypothesize serial mediator.
Okay. So this is a pair example of network modeling.
So it's not possible for hypothesizing this serial mediator. Because serial mediator, you need to support theory for all paths of your indirect.
Okay. Okay, Prof. Okay. Thank you, Prof. Thank you so much.
Okay. Okay. No problem.
Prof, may I ask a question related to this phenomena we have been discussing? So since I'm naive to all this discussion, but I have one question, sir. How to hypothesize mediation role of multiple mediator variable between IV and DV? How to hypothesize mediation role of multiple mediator variables between IV and DV?
Multiple mediator means serial mediator.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So just now I explained how we can hypothesize serial mediator.
So
for serial mediator, we need to support by theory different part of relationship. So if we have serial mediator and these serial mediator are connected together, so you need to support by theory. Again, I emphasize on this one.
Theory.
Because I want you to don't take this wrong. I'm not talking about statistical assessment. I'm talking about theoretical support and hypothesis development. Okay. Okay. If you have this serial mediator, you need to support effect of IV on DV overall, based on and effect of IV on mediator and mediator on DV based on theory to be able to write and hypothesize mediation hypothesis. Serial mediator. Okay, so you have M1 and M2. You want to hypothesize effect of X to Y, but through M1 and M2. So you need to support from theory for the effect of X to Y, overall effect of X to Y, not direct effect. And effect of X to M1, M1 to M2, and M2 to be able to hypothesize serial mediator. Serial mediator means you say X has indirect effect on Y through M1 and M2 together. This is the meaning of serial mediator.
So there should be a joint effect of serial mediator on DV.
Joint effect of IV on DV. I didn't get
joint effects of mediator variables on DV. Once you talk about together effects of serial variables, yeah.
Okay. Here we have A1.
So
this one is B1, and this one is C1, right? You can see my screen. So when you say X to Y, X has indirect effect on Y through M1 and M2 means you have to assess A1, B1, C1. You have to assess significance of this term. Serial mediator means significance of this term. Significance of this term, okay, you apply a statistical technique to assess significance of this term, these three. But in first place, you have to justify effect of X on Y overall, effect of X on M1, M1 on M2, and M2 to Y for hypothesis development to hypothesize effect of X to M1 to M2 to Y. So this is serial mediator. So for hypothesis development, for development of this type of hypothesis, this is very complex hypothesis, right? But for this hypothesis, you need support from literature and theory to support X to Y, to justify effect of X to Y, X to M1, M1 to M2, and M2 to Y.
Thank you very much, sir. Now it's very much clear.
Hello, hello, Professor. May I ask? Hello.
Yes, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
I have a supplementary question regarding this topic. That is, in your earlier session, you talk about it is not mandatory to find out the mediator in your existing literature, and it may be new dimension for a research, and it is not mandatory for to find out some from theory or existing literature. So can you clear this statement, that is is it mandatory to find out the mediators from existing literature and
No,
theory?
no.
Is it mandatory?
No,
If
it's not mandatory.
because I'm working in a paper and I couldn't find so much. I couldn't find relevant some construct, but I couldn't find exact construct from existing literature or theories right now. But I have
construct or mediator. You don't need to find exactly mediation of a variable in literature.
Yeah.
It's not compulsory. But if you want to hypothesize mediator, you have to support a relationship between IV and DV based on theory and literature, IV and mediator in the literature and theory, and mediator on DV from theory and literature. Not exactly assessment of mediator in the literature.
Okay, fine. Thank you. Clear, Professor.
Okay.
Thank
you. Prof?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
My question is regarding the higher order construct as a DV, formative. Mediation.
Okay, this session is on mediator. Can just focus on question for mediator, please?
This is the mediation is between higher order construct, IV and DV.
Okay, so
the mediation is, but the IV is formative, and DV is reflective formative.
Okay, so what's your question?
My question is how to report the mediation between these two variables.
Exactly same as first order. Because assessment of mediator is in a structural level.
Yep.
And assessment of the higher order construct is in measurement level. So if we're going to assessment of a structural level, you have to establish your second order using, for example, two-stage approach. In this example, I show you, okay, in this example here, exactly this mediator is second order reflective formative, right? You calculated this one last week. So before assessment of mediator, you have to establish second order measurement level, and then you run for assessment of mediator. So it doesn't matter your construct is higher or second order or first order, because you already dealt with the measurement at
the measurement, yeah.
And you assess measurement model, and now you want to assess a structural model, right? So there is not any difference between higher order or first order in assessment of mediator.
Okay, thank you, Prof.
Okay, no problem.
Doctor?
Just can we have last question?
Yes, doctor. I just have one question regard to the supporting from literature review. So if we supporting from literature review and find there's empirical study, say this is mediate between this and this. So what's the thing new that I can introduce to the literature review?
You have to support based on empirical study and also theory, not only empirical study. So if you support based on empirical study and theory, you can hypothesize mediator. And again, I emphasize that you don't need to find exactly mediation assessment or that hypothesize mediator for your mediator, right? If only you find the relationship between IV and DV overall, and you support this relationship based on literature and theory, and also effect of IV-M mediator and mediator on DV, so you can hypothesize mediator. Actually, I believe that Baron and Kenny approach and 3 steps of Baron and Kenny is still valid for hypothesis development, for development of mediation hypothesis, but not for statistically assessment of mediator. For assessment of mediator is not valid, but for hypothesizing the mediator, because Baron and Kenny say, okay, the relationship between IV and DV should exist, and IV to M and M to DV. So it means we can get these 3 steps for hypothesizing mediator. So no need to have mediator in previous study, but we need to have these steps. We need to have support for these 3 steps. But assessment of mediator, statistical assessment, is only based on product of coefficient and significance of indirect.
Okay. Then, Prof, we called the type of relation between IV to DV and IV to mediator. It is causal relationship, or we just say relationship? Like here, because there is one line arrow from exogenous to mediator and one line from mediator to endogenous. So in this case, we call causal relationship, or we call just relationship.
So it's depend on the use of this word, but actually this is causal relationship. Yes, it's causal relationship.
And how can we differentiate?
But we don't use causal relationship in hypothesis development. Most of the time we use effect. If you want to differentiate between 2, this is not very certain, but when we say relationship, sometimes refer to correlation, because so we have bidirectional. But when we say effect, refer to causal relationship, but it's not certain. In many studies, they use also relationship for the effect of IV on DV, or some studies use effect. So you can find these different words exchangeably in different studies.
Thank you, bro.
Okay.
Professor, can I ask one question, please? My question is not regarding.
Yeah, please. This
okay.
The last question.
First of all, thank you very much for this very effective knowledge that imparts us a lot. Actually, I'm studying in China, and mostly professor asked us when we introduce some model, some type of model, and we say that literature support this theory and literature support this variables. Then he asked only one question, that what's the novelty in this paper?
What's that?
So what's the novelty? What is new in this paper? What is new in
novelty,
this model?
right? Yeah.
So yeah, novel. So when we go on novel, if I read 50 paper and there only 1 and 2 mediating variable, and I introduce some another variable that mediating, that I'm thinking that this mediate the IV and DV, but from my thinking there is no literature, there is no theory that. So if we go on statistical side, if I hypothesize something and it's something effective, then how can I introduce my novelty on literature behalf?
Okay, and the concept of novelty and originality is very subjective, and yeah, there are many papers that how we can justify the novelty of our work and the originality of our work, but actually this depends on your interpretation and your justification for novelty of your work. If there is not any study, previous study on this topic, and for example, assessment of mediator, or sometime when you introduce moderator and you compare different situations together, and there is no any other previous study on this one, and also you can come out with some new result. You can come out with some original result that previous study not found these original results. So you can justify as an originality and novelty of your study, right? But it's depend on your justification, and depends on actually the available previous studies on the topic that you are working, and so there is not any, based on my understanding, there is not a very clear way for justification of novelty and originality. There are some papers.
Yeah, when my professor asked me that who said this, I say I'm saying
No,
this. He said, who are you?
originality and novelty is not something that somebody said. Yes, to justify the gap, to justify the problem in your introduction, for example, and when you want to identify your research objective to address this gap, you need to refer to some previous study that they highlight this gap. So to highlight the problem, you need to refer to some previous studies. But for novelty and originality of your study based on your finding, what you find, if you identify the gap clearly and you can justify that your finding is some answer, some solution for those gaps that highlighted by previous study, so maybe this can be a good way to justify originality and novelty of your study.
Okay, Professor, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for attending this session. And next session will be next Thursday, and will be last session of this online course. In next session, I will focus on the moderator and multi-group analysis, and see what's the meaning of moderator and multi-group analysis, and how we can perform two main types of moderator, interaction effect, and multi-group analysis in SmartPLS.